Kia ora everyone, welcome back. So we have had the presentation, we've gone through the presentation and we're now into questions. I don't have the speaking queue from earlier, so if you had signalled that you'd like to ask questions, please make sure you jump back in the queue. So first up, we've got Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So I've got a couple of questions around the Addiston Reserve. So in the report, it seemed to be that there would only be an additional 14 sections created by using that part of the reserve. But when I looked at the structure plan, it looked like there would be a lot more than 14. So are you able to clarify how many extra sections would be delivered by using that portion of the reserve? It seemed to go from 1,050 to 1,064 in the report, but the structure plan, it looked like there would be a lot more than just 14.
I'd have to reconfirm those figures with the urban designers, but those were the figures that were provided to us as the options. So 1050 for the non-use of Addistone Reserve and 1064 for the repurposing of the Addistone Reserve. I can double check that and come back to you. I do wonder whether or not potentially it might relate to lot configuration, but could I come back to you on that?
Yep, that's okay. The other question was also about the reserve, and it's described in the report as being underutilised and just a flat piece of grass, basically. In terms of, once it's been built on, is the plan that we don't think more flat reserve for playing fields or whatever would be needed in that part of town? Or is the plan that we would use that part of the reserve for housing and create another reserve elsewhere, perhaps further out, to provide the provision for playing fields? I wasn't really 100% sure on that.
I think certainly the park and services assessment covers those particular questions, and I understand that Aaron's here and able to address that.
Testing. I haven't used this one before. Hello, Aaron. Good afternoon. It's Aaron Phillips. I'm the Activity Manager for Parks. Councillor, in respect to your question about the use for sports fields, there's quite a tortured history of this piece of land that I could take you through, but addressing your point a little bit more directly, in the early 2000s there was a plan to do a land exchange with a developer up there and develop junior sports fields, not senior fields. At the time, a deal couldn't be struck and there were issues with access to the reserve being negotiated with the developer. That didn't proceed. Following that, in 2005, the Recreation Needs Assessment of the time found that we didn't need additional sports fields back in 2005. More recently, an assessment of sports fields needs has concluded that we've got enough at the moment, but we will need more in the future. But our contention is that this isn't the right place for them. They'd be at the end of a difficult cul-de-sac situation in a Kauteri with poor access, and we'd be far better off providing them in Kakatangiata or through other means. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that explanation. That's it. Thank you, Madam Chair. 2 questions.
Thank you, Councillor.
Sorry, Councillor Johnson, just in terms of your earlier question, if you turn to page 118 and 119 of the hard copy water paper, so those 2 diagrams show option 1 and option 2 for the structure plan. So the structure plan is entirely the same for the whole balance of the land. So the only difference is in and around Addistone Reserve. So I've just done a quick count up. So the difference is effectively the additional lots you get in option 1 versus option 2. And it was a very quick count, but there was 14 additional.
Okay.
So so if you would just look at those 2 diagrams, are the only 2 differences.
Right.
The rest of the structure plan is the same.
Thank you for explaining that. I had not realised that it was the one that's option 2 is the sort of base option, and the other one was in addition to that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so option 2 is the reserve as it is at the moment, or the spatial extent of the reserve as it is at the moment. Option 1 is with the smaller reserve, which would be the recommended proposal as part of the reserves at consultation.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind it would then be a council decision as to whether they chose option 1 or 2.
Thank you. The light has dawned.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the report. Am I getting the right sense that somehow the retirement village is not desirable, at least at the proposed place?
No, with respect, councillor, the structure plan puts forward 2 options for that particular area within the structure plan landmass, and one of them is a retirement village that can connect in with the surrounding roading network, that fronts well into the local business zone, that provides a good level of density in terms of supporting that centre, and that option is shown in the carve-out on the structure plan. And if that retirement village proposal was delivered in accordance with that, the provisions support the activity being assessed as a discretionary activity, and then it would be a matter for it to be assessed on its merits as to whether it would be granted. But the structure plan anticipates a retirement village of that ilk.
Okay, one more question related to that same issue. On page 114, the report says that the collaborative process with the developer was useful but couldn't get the desired outcome. So how it was useful if we couldn't get the desired results?
I think that what it enabled council officers and the landowner to do was to identify that there was a willingness and a desire to use the land in a kotiri in this particular area for a retirement village. It provided the ability for there to be a level of understanding of what that activity looked like, and then there was discussions around how that activity might be incorporated into the structure plan in a way that enabled the structure plan and what the purpose of it and what it was intending to create could also be implemented, whether they could sit side by side. And the discussions never got to a point where there was a full understanding of how that might work, but it enabled the council officers to still be able to present a retirement village option that was consistent with and complementary to the structure plan approach that they want to take.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Just following on from Councillor Butt's question around the retirement home and the engagement with the landowner, are you able to give an indication as to what stage of the plans your view is that the landowner's at with that? Is it still an early concept stage, or have they got design plans? Have they got a provider to partner with to deliver the facilities, services, etc., or is it still sort of quite early concept plans?
I'd prefer the applicant or the landowner to be able to speak to those matters than myself, but as I understand it, there is a team that's been put together to enable an assessment of the use of the land for a retirement village proposal. There have been some options explored, and there are steps being progressed towards compiling a proposal that would form the basis of an application. But how far progressed they are, I couldn't talk to anymore. But at the time that there were discussions with officers, there were conceptual plans that were presented from council officers that were had feedback as to whether or not the landowner's views aligned with those.
Thank you, that's helpful. Councillor Harpiter.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you. This has been a really good document. It's really transparent, so thank you for that. Just a question around the consultation document. So recommendation 3 talks about going out for consultation. So my first question is, who will you consult with?
So what the RMA requires for a district plan change is that it is fully publicly notified, so anybody within the city or even beyond the city could submit, so it's full public notification, but there's an obligation for us to serve notice on affected parties, so typically that will be obviously the affected landowners in the immediate surrounding area. So. Okay,
and what kind of document will you send out? Will it be similar to what we've been given today?
So the RMA is quite prescriptive about the public consultation process we have to run. So there'll be a letter and a public notice which then directs members of the public who are wanting to submit to the material, which will be available in hard copy and online. So we have to make all 1,000 pages available. But there, as I said, there'll be a letter of public notice. In the past, we have done some additional sort of fact sheets or summaries which break it down, but that's in addition to the minimum requirements of the Act, and would be looking for a plan change of the scale. We'll be looking at doing something similar.
So the explanation of options 1 and 2, will they be made quite clear so people understand the difference between option 1 and 2?
Yes. Just to be clear, there will. I probably misinterpreted your question in relation to recommendation 3. So there will be public consultation under the RMA for the plan change, which will include, and that material includes both options for the reserve.
Yep.
Separately, there will be a Reserves Act consultation exercise specifically on Adderstone Reserve and the 2 reserve options, but what we're saying is people will be able to look at those 2 reserves options in the context of the broader plan for a kotiri rather than it being a specific Adderstone Reserve exercise. So they would run concurrently to an extent, bearing in mind the RMA process will take longer than the Reserves Act process. But the process we see is that the council would make a decision on the Reserves Act consultation, and that would then inform the processes that follow for the district plan change.
Okay. Knowing that you have to put a 100-page document in front of people, it's just to get quality information back is going to be...
Yeah, well, as I said, we'll meet the minimum requirements of the RMA, but we'll also look at some ways of breaking down the material so people understand, a bit like the PowerPoint today, people understand
Yep.
At a high level what's proposed.
Final question, Madam Chair, sorry. Just about the cul-de-sac on Abbey Road. Just wanted a comment from you, Shannon, about what you'll be actually putting in there about the cul-de-sac.
There'll be nothing specific in the there's nothing specific in the plan change material about the pros and cons of the cul-de-sac at Abbey Road. The committee report talks about the fact that there was an application for a cul-de-sac at Abbey Road that was turned down. That's public information, but it's not it sort of relates more to that notice for requirement than the plan change. But as you would have seen, the structure plan shows a connection from Abbey Road to Johnston Drive, which is an outcome which is anticipated or desirable under the structure plan.
Councillor McCarlid.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the officers as well for the comprehensive report and the PowerPoint presented. I think, well, 1 or 2 of my questions have already been teased up by one of my colleagues, but I am unsure about one thing, and probably just need a bit of clarification. On page 108, I think the first paragraph said that, second sentence, Adderstone Reserve has been assessed as having limited community benefit. And I sort of just wanted to understand what are the criteria for assessing such statements, or how do we come to that conclusion?
Aaron, can you just introduce your full name and your title as well for people online who missed it the first time?
Apologies. It's Aaron Phillips. I'm the Activity Manager for Parks. The area it's not the entirety of Addistone Reserve that comment refers to. It's a triangular piece of land that you can see in the documents before you. That piece of land is currently managed through a grazing lease. So, apologies, not a grazing lease, a grass harvesting lease. So at the moment we grow grass on it and it's cropped off regularly. So at the moment the public access to that piece of land is fully available, but it's not managed in a way where there's much use of the land. It grows long grass.
Okay, cool. And one more question, if I may. Is the reason, let me rephrase that. Is there a reason why we're partially repurposing this land? Is it because of the geotechnical analysis that has been done to it? Because as part of the PowerPoint, there was a red area and a green area. I can't really remember the page, but it was a part of the PowerPoint. And I was wondering why, page 117, please. And I just wanted to understand why one side has been left out and the other has been considered to be repurposed for housing.
If I may, I can speak to the origin of that diagram, which is Aaron's report, but as I understand it, you shouldn't read too much into the red colour. It simply illustrates the area that is capable of being considered for reuse. So it's not a no-go zone, or it was just Aaron, it's this diagram here, it's your figure 9. It's just a way of illustrating an area that has been assessed in a particular way by Mr. Phillips. As to why it's been considered for housing, given that this plan change is in terms of the repurposing and its future use, I can speak from a plan change council officer perspective, which is that this plan change is about growth and meeting your needs, or the city's needs in terms of provision of housing and variety. So any land that potentially is available to be able to be used for that housing need was considered.
No, I perfectly understand that. But I think I was just trying to understand the geotechnical analysis done and how we came to that. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just add to that as well, I think one thing we need to remember is this is the first time in 30 years there's been a holistic planning exercise for Kautiri as a suburb. So, this reserve was acquired, whether it was 25, 30 years ago, in the absence of an overall plan. So part of the process of doing that overall plan is to look at the overall reserve allocation as a whole and reflect on our needs, which is part of the work that Aaron did to feed into this work.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have a number of questions. I might check in with you midway. Thank you, David. Thank you, Shannon, for covering this report for us. First question relates to the agenda papers. On page 114, there's some discussion around the village centre and kind of to what extent the planning exercise will hold sway and to what extent the kind of developers' existing aspirations might hold sway. There's a sentence in there that says the council could consider other mechanisms to try and protect the outcomes sought in the structural plan. Could you give us some insight into what those other mechanisms are?
As I understand this report, it's talking about other opportunities that might exist for council to deliver the intent of the structure plan, but that would in all likelihood require a part 2 conversation, councillor.
So if I could add to that briefly, so district plan changes have no legal effect until such time as a decision is made by commissioners, but there are mechanisms that the council could consider, but there are pros and cons and risks to those which would be best addressed in a Part 2 report, which officers are considering bringing, but at this stage we're bringing the plan change to you, which we think is ready for notification.
Thank you.
I would note there as well as the structure plan councillor, if I may, that the objectives and policies that are provided alongside the structure plan, remember in the presentation I spoke about inserting the structure plan into the district plan with accompanying provisions. So the objectives and policies have taken a directive approach to the type of development and use and the outcomes that this council would like to see in Okotiri. So that is also another reason that that sentence would be in there. There's other ways other than just the plan to deliver the structure plan, I should say. It's a package.
Thank you for those answers. Second question's around housing density. Words were used this morning like provide for and incentivized. So are we taking merely an enabling approach, or are we actually ensuring or guaranteeing to the community that those medium density outcomes will be delivered?
The structure plan, and if I could refer you again to structure plan 7A.3b, that's in appendix 2 of the section 32 report, but it does show lot pattern and density. This is one of the structure plans that development needs to be in accordance with, and it very clearly delineates where medium density housing is expected. And alongside that, it actually provides lot configuration. So the structure plan is directing a very is directing a certain type of lot layout to account for density outcomes that the council officers are seeking to achieve. So I would suggest, councillor, that it is a directive approach that's been taken. That always needs to be balanced against characteristics or particular things that may arise in a site-specific application, but the structure plan approach is certainly directing an outcome in Okotiri.
Thank you. Question in the transport space. Was quite heartened by some of the presentation this morning, but we face some of those issues on our own. We face some of those issues with Wakakatahi being the controlling authority for State Highway 57. So just wanted to understand the slide this morning that said there would be solutions to some of the key infrastructure issues, if I can paraphrase broadly. Do those include the intersections that we had challenges with Wakakatahi around Old West Road, Pacific Drive, Ruapehu Drive, etc.?
Yes, at the moment the provisions reflect the advice of Harriet Fraser, which is that certain works and upgrades of intersections, and those include some of the Wakakatahi that they have responsibility for, intersections, that those works need to be completed and certified to the satisfaction of council before development can proceed. So they are built into the plan provisions. They will require those works to be completed, and if they're not, then the activity is assessed as a non-complying activity. So the consenting pathway isn't as enabling. It requires council officers to have a much more rigorous look at whether or not, though, that development should occur.
Thank you. Can I just understand that answer in the context of what I understand is the Kiki Whenua situation, where I understand that we had some conditions issued around Wakakatahi needing to deliver some safety upgrades to transport infrastructure, and that was successfully appealed to my understanding. As my fundamental question is this more resilient to appeal than what's happened in Kiki Whenua?
I think that there is a much earlier signal around the intention for there needing to be those discussions with Wakakatahi, and they have started. They have had the opportunity to review Harriet Fraser's report. They agree in principle with her findings, and they understand that there is a need to work with council around timing of delivery of those works. Those discussions will continue in parallel with the notification process, and certainly council officers are working very hard to make sure that those discussions are productive.
So to me, the developer is the third sort of partner in that dance. So to what extent, if Wakatahi negotiations were not to proceed in the timeframe and manner that we hope, to what extent would this plan then be constraining on the developers to limit the housing and people coming into that environment until such time as the transport infrastructure was provided?
Certainly the plan will, in its current form, require a greater look, a closer look at those proposals until those works were done. And that's because the advice of Harriet Fraser is that there are already a level of service issues and safety concerns at those intersections, and they raise implications for putting further vehicle load onto the roads at the current time. So I accept your point that there is a timing issue, and Waka Kotahi are very aware of council officers' intentions. The provisions provide opportunity for those discussions to be had and a timeframe for within which they can occur, and we just keep pushing hard.
Thank you for that. Just wanted to ask around school provision as well. There's some mention of it in section 32, paragraph 77, but just in kind of everyday street person terms, what's the plan, if any, for provision of schools in the future as this part of the community is built up?
I'll double check what the wording should be, but there is no provision for a school within the structure plan area. However, the discussions with the Ministry of Education resulted in another school location being found within the broader Okotiri area. It will be able to support the needs of the structure plan growth, but it will be outside of the boundaries of the structure plan area.
Thank you. So just wanted to clarify then, is that the existing country school or is that a new school coming into the mix?
My apologies, I should have been clear. It's a new school.
It is. Okay, thank you.
So there was some conversations very early in the structure plan process about the merits or otherwise of relocating the site which the ministry has on Ruapehu Drive to the northern side of State Highway 57, but then the ministry chose to stick with the site that they have on Ruapehu Drive.
Thank you. Two further questions, if I might.
You're the only person in the queue, Councillor, so you're the person between us and this item finishing.
Thank you for that ringing endorsement, Madam Chair. Look, I do have some questions around the MPS urban development and how it relates to what's in front of us. My understanding is that our statutory obligation is to give effect. Is that indeed the case?
Yes, and give effect has the simple meaning of implement.
In paragraph 48, we say that the proposed plan change gives effect to the NPS as far as it is relevant to the plan change. So could you outline the parts of the NPS that we're kind of setting aside with that sentence?
I believe that what was intended by that sentence was that Okotiri, given the land area that we are dealing with, is only a partial response to your broader obligations to meet housing need within your city. So this is one of a number of plan changes, as you will be very familiar with, to deliver on your NPSUD obligations. But to the extent that it's a growth area identified as part of your strategy documents, this plan change provides housing choice, density options, and also intends to ensure that it's infrastructure ready, and finally provides business land through a local business zone as well. That's a very summary, obviously very off-the-cuff summary of your NPSUD
really
obligations.
Helpful. That's really helpful.
They're more onerous, but...
Very helpful. Can I just ask then how we overall assess the giving of effect? And I suppose the contrast that I saw was that when it came to the regional policy statement, we had 6 pages of quite detailed analysis on how we were giving effect to the RPS, whereas, at least to my reading of the document, the giving effect to the MPS was quite broad statements, just saying that we're doing it.
Yes, I think that that section should be read in context with section 2, which provides section 2.1, commencing at paragraph 13. It sets out the resource management issue around the growth context. It sets out the urban development targets, and it goes on to discuss various considerations around where the housing need is and how it's responding in line with the NPSUD. So potentially there should have been a cross-reference back there, Councillor, to help round that out.
Thank you for that clarification. So can I ask then, within that paragraph that you're referring to, have we provided assessment around the 8th objective of the MPS, which is supporting reduction in greenhouse gas emissions?
Certainly, I'm also just flagging on to table 3 at paragraph 27, which also analyses a number of your strategies that align with the NPSUD, and I had thought that there'd be something in there. There's an analysis of the Climate Change Plan 2021 at page 29, and it talks about proposed PCG helping to contribute to the more efficient development and aiding with that climate change plan. So,
thank you. That's helpful to understand how far that assessment was taken. Finally, a brief question just around language. I see this space and I just think Summerhill. That's the only thing I think. And I'm just concerned that potentially we go out with a message to the community about a spatial plan for Akaltari, and they kind of miss the point of actually where it is. So can we get some understanding of kind of how the messaging and comms will support people actually understanding where this is relative to other landmarks and places in Akaltari?
Yeah, I recall a conversation on this actually with Councillor Bowen as well, and we certainly checked in with Rangatane, and from their perspective they were very comfortable with the naming of, given the spatial extent of this plan change, that Akaltari was an appropriate name for it. I appreciate that that doesn't necessarily mean that the community will appreciate the spatial extent of Akaltari in terms of the same way Rangatane do. So, consistent with my answer to Councillor Harper's question earlier, in terms of some of the supporting material over and above the minimum requirements of the Act, we can connect with our comms and engagement team and look at how we can ensure that the material is as well received as possible in terms of the local community and understanding actually what we're talking about in terms of the extent of the plan change. So.
Thank you. And finally, arising from the presentation this morning, you spoke about a 5-meter no build. Can I just clarify, is that retained in public ownership as a no build, or is that part of what goes into private ownership but has a covenant or something that prevents a build?
It'll be retained in private ownership, and the idea is through the comprehensive development plan at the time of subdivision, the landowner will show how that 5-metre strip is provided, and they also need to secure that strip via consent notice. So it will be protected. It will have legal protection in that regard. The zoning for the conservation and amenity zone will be taken from the 5-metre boundary of the setback closest to the gully edge.
Thanks. So to clarify expectation around that then, in terms of recreational access, that wouldn't really be on the cards. It's private ownership, and so therefore at the discretion of the owner. Private
ownership, and it forms a part of the stormwater management system.
Thank you. Madam Chair, the end.
Excuse me, Madam Chair, just in the spirit of transparency, I've just reflected on an answer that I provided earlier on Adderstone Reserve, and I'd just like to clarify one point. So Aaron talked about the overall reserves assessment that was completed, and I talked about the fact that there was this is the first time in, say, 30 years there's been a comprehensive plan for Akaltari. As detailed in the report under the section on the notice of requirement for Abbey Road, one of the other advantages of repurposing part of Adderstone Reserve is it will add value to it will add a value to land which is owned by the council, which could potentially be of value in terms of the council negotiating the Abbey Road connection and the notice of requirement, which is still under appeal. So in short, both options, as detailed in the report, both options 1 and 2 for Adderstone Reserve, as you will see in the images, rely on a connection between Abbey Road and Johnston Drive. There's no guarantee that that connection will be able to be delivered at this stage because that notice of requirement is under appeal, and we will have to work through a process to resolve that appeal. One of the advantages is, in addition to the ones we've already talked about in terms of repurposing the balance of that reserve, is it may well assist us with that negotiation in terms of connecting Abbey Road to Johnston Drive. But my comments earlier about the fact that the council still will have to make a decision on that Reserves Act process independent of this remains. So there is no decision made yet around the repurposing of that reserve.
Thank you for the clarification. I think the report also was quite clear around the appeals process and that being separate. So, thank you. There are no further questions, so I'm closing questions. Thank you very much for presenting the report. Thank you as well, Shannon, for making yourself available again this afternoon to come back in and answer questions. It has been very helpful for people. So I'm going to move recommendation 1 to 4, seconded by Councillor Hancock. I'm going to read these now quickly so that I don't need to read them when it comes to us voting on them. So recommendation 1, that the council approve the Palmerston North City District Plan proposed plan change G, Akotiri urban growth, attached under separate cover for public notification under clause 5, schedule 1 of the Resource Management Act 1991. Number 2, that the council authorise the chairperson and deputy chairperson of the Planning and Strategy Committee to make minor amendments to the Palmerston North City District Plan proposed plan change G, Akotiri urban growth, prior to public notification. Number 3, that the Chief Executive prepare a public consultation document on the partial repurposing of Adderstone Reserve for housing under the Reserves Act 1977, and that this consultation be undertaken in parallel with the public notification of Palmerston North City District Plan, proposed plan change G, Akotiri urban growth. And number 4, that a decision on the proposed partial repurposing of Adderstone Reserve be made in advance of the hearing for proposed plan change G, Akotiri urban growth. We get some good recommendations through this committee. They're always very lengthy. So just in brief, I'm very happy to see this come through to the next stage. This, first of all, I want to acknowledge the staff involved in this, both in-house staff and people that we have pulled in to work on this. This has been a massive piece of work. And from the perspective of somebody who has been involved in district plan work over the last few years, I would say that this has been one that has been very much front foot forward from those involved. There has been, I think, an increased level of transparency around some of the issues that have come up as this piece of work has happened. You'll recall that we did have a report come through around some of the transportation issues that had been identified a couple of months ago. And just in general, I think Councillor Hapara made the comment as well around the transparency. I think the issues have very much been laid out on the table. I think it's quite clear through this, and so I would be surprised if there were sort of little surprise nuggets coming out through this one. But it is really exciting to see this come forward. I think that we have seen a bit of ad hoc development up in Akotiri, and that is an area that has got some land available for development with some, land zone changes. And so it is exciting to see a structure plan focusing on some mixed housing options in terms of especially medium density, but also the business kind of designations to have little local centres, I think is really important for creating small communities within the city. The only other comment I wanted to make was around some questions from Councillor Barrett around the name, and I guess I know that, I know lots of local people will see that as Summerhill, and so they may not identify that as a direct connection to a kotiri, but I remember when I first came on council and we had a briefing on a reserve, and the reserve was called Tumotopoto, and I had never heard of that because I thought it was called Porkchop Hill, and I thought Porkchop Hill was the official name. So I think actually, names that we connect to certain places, whether they are pet names or whether they are formal names, actually those can adapt and those can change as we learn the history of our community, and particularly when iwi are gifting names or wanting to reconnect to original names of places. I think actually we can just take our community on that journey and make it really clear that we might call parts of this area Summerhill, but actually this is a kotiri, and we can also ensure that we are pronouncing names correctly along with that. So I don't think that that's as big of a concern. I think it'll be quite clear with maps and even within the wider structure plan around what we are talking about when we talk about Plan Change G. Right, Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few comments. First, absolute gratitude to the officers and team that have brought this together. It is obvious that a huge amount of hard work has gone in, so fully concur with the Chair's comments there. I think it really does outline both the exciting but quite challenging future of this part of the city. The master plan looks magnificent. I think it's really exciting, and we'll actually get quite a bit of positive feedback and interest. A couple specific things. Firstly, I'm not a fan of urban sprawl or suburban sprawl, but at least this is getting up away from those high class and flood prone soils and kind of into area that we can see through that lens. Very high natural amenity and some enablement at least, and it sounds like strong incentives for density. Huge step forward, reading in the report that we've got a 2-kilometer cul-de-sac. It's not really useful to have a 2-kilometer cul-de-sac. It's also not useful to have a gateway to the city that has an endless fence backing onto it and no visual appeal. So really, really excited about getting out of the market-led permissive approach and getting into a more directive approach. I think the community and future communities will really appreciate that. There's 4 areas that I am somewhat, I guess, concerned, but also somewhat heartened by in terms of responses received today. The first is really around those transport challenges. I do not want to see this turn into Napier Road 2.0. We need to make sure that Whakatahi is actually with us and delivering on this in a timely manner. And it's, we don't have a huge number of cards we can play with them, but I hope that we play those cards as well as possible so that we can get there. The second one's around housing density, and especially as density actually relates to affordability. We have a chance of getting some good outcomes there. And I am pleased to hear some of the legal speak around how we actually have some assurance that that is a likely outcome that we can at least strongly incentivize through this. I must say I'm not yet convinced on the flatland argument around Adderston Reserve, and especially the idea of kind of shipping little kitties out of Akautari and off to Kiki Whenua to do their kind of local sports on flat ground. Yes, this part of the city is blessed with open space, and most of it is a very steep hill. And I think actually the flat bits are rare as can be up there, and we should be very, very cautious before we see those lost to development, even if it does ease an access issue and create a bit more housing. We need to make sure we're building all the parts of a community, not just the housing parts. And finally, around the NPS, I appreciated the answers received around kind of how we're demonstrating giving effect. To my mind and preference, that's still quite a light touch of evidence and analysis around things as we're starting to see emissions reduction plans come into the Aotearoa's legal framework, as we're seeing the NPS for urban development kind of mature and be used. And I guess what I'd like to see there is that we could actually hand on heart say, we've done an assessment and it shows that we're reducing emissions in a way that is actually consistent with some of the national direction, 30% reduction in emissions, transport by 2030, net zero by 2050. How are we doing this planning in a way that actually gives effect to that? Because these houses are going to be there in 2030, 2040, and 2050, and we will need to be operating in a much lower emissions framework than we are today. So that's just reflections on the plan as it is set to go out the door, and very excited about getting the community feedback on this. The future of how we do planning in this city cannot look like the past, and I think this shows us a path to get there. So very much looking forward to next steps. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Hapara.
Just briefly, Madam Chair. I just want to say I really, really commend Michael for the work that he has done on this document, and just please say thank you from us to him, David. And I just want to say well done on being as transparent as he has been in this document. It is good to go out for consultation on this plan change, but also on the reserve, and in the way in which these are done in conjunction with each other is a good process going forward, and a healthy process going forward. I think the community, once they understand the process, will appreciate it. So I think as long as it's understood what they are consulting on, I think it'll be well understood. Not well understood, but it'll be really appreciated in the long run. So I think it'll be a good process once it's clear of what they are being consulted on, and I think it'll be really good to be able to get it out there to the community. So well done. Thank you.
Right, we've got no further questions, so I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. Moving on to our final item, number 9, our work schedule for June 2022, and I will hand over to David Murphy to provide any updates.
No specific comment. The only thing I did do this morning reflecting on this list is I suspect there has been some confusion around the way the quarters have been interpreted based on financial year or calendar year in terms of items 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11. Certainly the ones I was populating, I was thinking calendar year, not financial year. So I will go back to the team and the CI, our Chief Infrastructure Officer, and just double check that we've got our quarters appropriate. From my perspective, it wasn't clear with calendar year versus, I know there's an asterisk here saying financial year, but I'm not sure it's been populated in that manner, so I will double check those and update them for next month.
Thank you, David. Are there any questions? Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thank you, David. That was the question I had, actually, just around those quarters. I was a little bit confused. Thanks.
Yeah. Actually, that reminds me too, Councillor Hancock, there was one amendment that we talked about at the order paper meeting which hasn't come through either, which talked about item 10 being an update on street racing, including the extension to parking areas, so that we were covering both the general update on street racing and those parking extensions, so we'll make sure that's updated as well. For some reason that's been missed.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you. Just a query when we could expect the first quarterly report around the nature calls?
I would need to check with Sarah on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, I will move the committee resolve that the Planning and Strategy Committee receive its work schedule dated June 2022, seconded by Councillor Hapara. Thank you. Are there any comments? Great. I'll invite you to vote. And that has carried 100%. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to staff especially. It's been a very long day. Nō reira, na mihi nui kia koutou, ina mana, ina reo, tēnā koutou katoa.